In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And corpse-starch. Block after block of gray, flavorless, technically nutritious nothing. Unless you're lucky. Unless one day, in a ruined sub-basement, you find a sealed door and something beautiful behind it. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about a cook. Just a cook. Brech Halvorn, 308th Suthorak Levy, a man whose entire war was fought with burner units and salvaged parts, turning the worst food in the galaxy into something a soldier could swallow without hating himself. He was proud of that. He cared about it the way a craftsman cares. Temperatures, ratios, timing, all of it held together with precision, because precision was the last thing he could control. And then the crates arrived, sealed, unmarked, full of ingredients that had no business being on a world like Gorven 4. Real ingredients, beautiful ingredients, the kind that make a cook kneel on a cold floor and weep. This is a Slaanesh story, but not the kind you're expecting. No excess, no noise, just flavor. Just the quiet, warm whisper that says, "You deserve this," and a man who believed it. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. I can taste you through the Vox. I know that sounds wrong. I know that sounds like the rambling of a man whose mind has come undone at the seams. And maybe it has. Maybe it has come apart in ways that cannot be stitched back together by any medici, or any confessor, or any amount of the Emperor's light. But I need you to understand that I am not speaking in metaphor. I can taste the static on this frequency. It has a flavor. Copper and old lightning and something underneath that reminds me of the way fear smells when a man has been afraid for so long that the fear has settled into his bones and started leaking out through his skin. I can taste that. I can taste everything now. My name is Brech Halvorn, and I was a cook. Not a soldier, not truly. Oh, they gave me a lasgun like everyone else when the levy came through Suthorak Minoris and scraped every warm body off the threshing fields. They dressed me in the same mud-colored flack as the rest of the 308th, and they stamped my name into the same muster rolls, and they shipped me across the same black void to the same dying world. But I was never a soldier. I was the man who kept the others alive between the killing, and there is a difference, even if the Departamento Munitorum never saw fit to acknowledge it. A soldier destroys. I sustained. That was my purpose, my function, my entire war. I made corpse-starch edible. I turned recycled protein slurry into something that a human being could swallow without gagging. I performed miracles of the lowest possible order, day after day after day, in a field kitchen that smelled of old grease and desperation, and I was proud of it. Throne help me, I was proud. I am telling you this so that you understand what came before. Because what came before matters. It matters more than anything, because a man does not simply wake up one morning and decide to become what I have become. There are steps. There is a path. And the path is paved with small decisions that seem reasonable at the time, each one a little further from the light than the last, each one a little easier than the one before it, until you look back and realize that you cannot see the light at all anymore, and the dark feels more like home than any place you have ever known. I should start at the beginning, or near enough to it. Gorven the Fourth. Even the name sounds like something choking. We had been on that world for 3 standard years by the time the crates arrived. 3 years of grinding urban warfare through the collapsed hive stacks of what had once been a moderately prosperous manufacturing center. The planet had been loyal once. Then it was contested. Then it was simply a wound in the Imperium's side that refused to close, a suppurating mess of rubble and resistance and counter-resistance that consumed regiments the way a furnace consumes fuel. The enemy was a patchwork of local separatists, rogue militia factions, and the scattered remnants of a cult that the commissariat insisted had been eradicated in the first year. They had not been eradicated. Nothing on Gorvin IV was ever truly eradicated. Things just sank into the rubble and waited. The 308th Southarak Levy had arrived as a full-strength regiment of 4,211 souls. By the time I am speaking of, we were fewer than 900, not because of any single catastrophic engagement, you understand. Gorvin IV did not kill you all at once. It killed you slowly, a handful at a time, through ambushes and collapses and infections, and the steady, grinding attrition of fighting in a city that was more ruin than structure. Every day we lost someone, sometimes 2, sometimes 5. Rarely more than that, but never none. The losses were so consistent, so metronomic, that after a while you stopped registering them as events and started treating them as weather. Private Sulis stepped on a pressure mine. Corporal Dryan took a round through the neck. Trooper Aneth simply vanished during a night patrol and was listed as missing, which on Gorvin IV was a polite way of saying dead without a body. And through all of that, I cooked. My kitchen was a repurposed loading bay in the basement level of what had once been a textile manufactory. The ceiling was low and the ventilation was worse, and the walls sweated a thin gray moisture that I never managed to identify, but learned to ignore. I had 3 burner units, 2 of which worked reliably, a preparation surface made from a salvaged hatch cover, and a collection of pots and implements that I had accumulated over the years through a combination of scavenging, bartering, and what I prefer to call creative requisition. It was not a kitchen by any civilized standard, but it was mine, and within its confines I exercised the only authority I possessed. The menu, such as it was, never varied. Corpse-starch. That is what we ate, day in and day out, because that is what the Departamento Munitorum provided. If you have never encountered corpse-starch, I will spare you the full details of its manufacture, though I suspect the name alone gives you a reasonable indication. It arrived in compressed blocks the color of old bone, dense and dry and faintly chemical, and it was technically nutritious in the way that fuel is technically flammable. It kept you alive. That was the entirety of its ambition. It tasted of nothing and everything at once, a kind of universal blandness that sat on the tongue like a damp cloth and refused to register as food in any meaningful sense. Some soldiers said it tasted like cardboard. Others said dust. A few insisted it tasted faintly of metal, and I believed them because the recycling process was not what anyone would describe as fastidious. My job, my art, my small and desperate contribution to the war effort was to make that substance bearable, not good. Good was beyond the reach of mortal ambition, but bearable, edible in a way that did not make you question why you were still alive. I had developed techniques over the years. Soaking the blocks overnight in whatever liquid was available softened the texture from geological to merely unpleasant. Charring the surface on a hot plate added a suggestion of flavor, a smokiness that the tongue could latch onto as evidence that what you were eating had at least been in proximity to actual cooking. When I could get my hands on anything remotely resembling seasoning, a pinch of salt traded from the Munitorum clerks, a handful of dried herbs scraped from some tenacious plant growing in the rubble, I hoarded it like a miser hoards coins and dispensed it with the precision of an apothecary. The men appreciated it. I do not say that out of vanity, though I suppose vanity was always my weakness even then. They told me so in the rough and inarticulate way that Guard soldiers express gratitude, which is to say they did not spit out their food, and some of them occasionally grunted in a manner that I chose to interpret as approval. Sergeant Koreth, who commanded what was left of 3rd Platoon, once told me that my corpse-starch was the only thing on Warhammer 4 that had not actively tried to kill him, and I treasured that compliment more than any commendation. It meant that I was doing something. It meant that even in this place, even surrounded by death and decay and the slow erosion of everything that made life worth living, I was providing a sliver of comfort. A reason to sit down, a reason to gather. A moment in the day when the war receded just far enough for a man to remember that he was human. That was what cooking meant to me. That is what you must understand. It was not just the preparation of food. It was the preservation of something essential, some ember of civilization that the war was trying to extinguish. Every meal I served was an act of defiance against the death and the mud and the endless gray sky of Gorvin IV. Every plate that came back empty was a small victory, and I clung to those victories because they were the only ones available to me, the only arena in which I could exercise any measure of competence or control. I had a staff, if you could call it that. 2 men assigned to kitchen duty on a rotating basis, usually the wounded who could still stand but could not fight, or the newly arrived replacements who had not yet been processed into a combat squad. They peeled and chopped and stirred and cleaned, and I directed them with a precision that I suspect they found excessive, given that we were producing the same gray slop every single day. But precision mattered to me. It mattered because if you let the standards slip in the kitchen, you were admitting that nothing mattered. And if nothing mattered, then what was the point of any of it? The preparation times, the temperatures, the ratios. I kept them constant. I kept them disciplined. I kept them right because right was the only thing I had left. There was a man named Vulk, Private First Class Peter Vulk, who assisted me more than most. He had lost the use of his left hand to a piece of shrapnel during a clearance operation in the lower hive stacks, and the medici had told him that the nerves would never reconnect, so he was assigned to support duties, which in practice meant he spent most of his time in my kitchen. He was a quiet man, Vulk, lean and careful and watchful, in the way that men become when they have seen enough to know that the universe is paying attention and does not like to be noticed. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his observations tended to be sharp and worth hearing. I liked him. He was good with a knife, even one-handed, and he understood that the kitchen was a place of order in a world of chaos. And he respected that order without needing to be told. I mention Vulk because he was the first to taste it, the first to eat what I had made at the end, and the first to show me what it did. But that comes later. That comes much later, and I am getting ahead of myself, which is a thing I have noticed I do now. Time does not move the way it used to. It bends and pools, and sometimes it runs backwards, and I find myself standing in 2 moments at once, the before and the after, unable to tell which is the memory and which is the present. This may be a symptom of what has happened to me. This may simply be madness. I no longer have the capacity to distinguish between the two. Gorvin IV, the kitchen, the war. Let me stay there for a while longer, in the before. The days had a rhythm. In a war zone, rhythm is what keeps you sane, even if the rhythm itself is insane. You wake before dawn because the shelling is lighter in the pre-dawn hours, and that is when the supply runners move. You light the burners and begin the soak cycle for the day's corpse-starch. You check your water supply, which on Gorvin IV was always the critical variable, because the municipal systems had been destroyed in the first year and everything had to be purified from rainwater collection, or, in dry periods, extracted from the sump reservoirs beneath the hive, which produced a liquid that was technically water in the same way that corpse-starch was technically food. You prepare, you cook, you serve. You clean. You do it again, and again, and again, until the rhythm becomes so deeply embedded in your body that you could do it blind, deaf, unconscious, dead, and your hands would still reach for the ladle. I had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of the same meal, the same kitchen, the same gray walls, sweating the same gray moisture. 3 years of serving men who were slowly being replaced by strangers, as the original complement of the 308th was whittled away and backfilled with transfers and conscripts, and occasionally with men whose previous unit designations had been struck from the records, which was never a good sign. 3 years, and in that time I had not once prepared a meal that I would describe as good. Adequate, yes. Consistent, yes. But good, no. Good required ingredients, and ingredients required a supply chain that valued something beyond mere caloric output, and such supply chains did not exist at the front lines of the Gorvin 4 theater of operations. I had, in the quiet hours between the serving and the cleaning, begun to forget what good food tasted like. This is a thing that happens so gradually that you do not notice it until it is done. You forget the specifics first, the precise flavor of a particular spice, the exact texture of properly cooked grain, the way meat tastes when it has been slow roasted until the fibers separate and the juices collect in the pan. Then you forget the categories. You forget what sweetness is, not as a concept, but as a sensation. You forget what richness means on the tongue. You forget the difference between eating and feeding, between a meal and a ration, between nourishment and mere survival. The tongue goes flat. The palate narrows until there is only acceptable and unacceptable, fuel and not fuel, and the vast universe of flavor that exists between those poles becomes a theoretical abstraction, something you know existed once but can no longer access, like a language you spoke as a child and lost through years of disuse. I thought about food constantly, not the corpse-starch, but real food, the food of Sutherac Minoris, which was an agri-world and therefore a world that understood what it meant to eat well, even if that understanding was limited to the coarse and hearty fare of farming communities. I thought about root stews thickened with grain flour and studded with chunks of cured grox meat. I thought about stone-baked flatbread pulled from the communal ovens that stood at the center of every settlement, still steaming, the crust crackling under your fingers. I thought about the harvest ales that my father brewed in the fermentation shed behind our dwelling, amber and strong and faintly sweet, the taste of autumn in a clay cup. These memories were so vivid and so painful that they functioned almost as a form of self-harm, a way of reminding myself what I had lost, what we had all lost, what the Imperium had taken from us in its infinite hunger for bodies and obedience. But memories, however vivid, do not nourish. And so I cooked the corpse-starch and served the corpse-starch and ate the corpse-starch. And I told myself that this was enough, that survival was its own reward, that the Emperor asked nothing more of me than that I keep these men fed and alive for one more day. And most days I believed it. Most days the pride I took in my small competence was sufficient to sustain me. Most days. It was on a day like any other that everything changed. The date, if it matters, was the 43rd day of the 7th month in the 3rd year of the Gorvin the 4th deployment, though I have since lost all faith in the accuracy of my timekeeping. Captain Roskith, who had assumed command of our company after Captain Niel was killed by a sniper in the previous season, ordered an advance through the Sector 12 industrial ruins, a push to secure a supply corridor that had been contested for months. The operation was expected to take 3 days. It took 5 because nothing on Gorvin the 4th ever went according to plan, and by the time we had secured the corridor and established a defensive perimeter, we had lost another 22 soldiers and gained approximately 400 meters of bombed-out warehouse space that smelled of chemical residue and old death. It was in one of those warehouses that we found them. I was not part of the advance, obviously. Cooks do not advance. Cooks follow, setting up in whatever sheltered space the combat troops have cleared, dragging their equipment forward like hermit crabs hauling their shells from one patch of rubble to the next. I was establishing my kitchen in a partially intact storage chamber on the ground floor of Warehouse 19, a designation that I suspect had been more interesting before the building lost its upper 3 stories to orbital bombardment. Vulk was with me as usual, along with a replacement trooper named Dareth, who had been assigned to kitchen duty because he had arrived at the front with a stress fracture in his ankle that the medici deemed insufficient for rear echelon evacuation, but sufficient to excuse him from patrol rotations. Dareth was young and earnest and utterly terrified, which on Gorvin IV was the only rational response to one's circumstances. It was Dareth who found the sub-basement. He had been looking for a water source, checking the lower levels for intact piping, when he discovered a sealed bulkhead door that had been welded shut from the outside. The welds were old, pre-war by the look of them, and the door itself bore markings that none of us recognized, though Vulk observed that the script looked like high Gothic administrative notation, the kind used by planetary governance rather than military logistics. Dareth, with the innocent enthusiasm of a man who has not yet learned that sealed doors on contested worlds should remain sealed, suggested we open it. I should have said no. I should have reported it to Sergeant Koreth and let the combat troops handle it. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the promise of anything at all that was not standard military issue was enough to overrule my better judgment. We cut through the welds with a plasma torch borrowed from the engineering section, and beyond the door we found a staircase that descended into a storage vault that had been hermetically sealed. And in that vault, stacked in neat rows from floor to ceiling, were crates, hundreds of crates, each one stamped with the seal of the Governor Primus of Gorvin IV. I opened the first crate with hands that were not entirely steady, and when I saw what was inside, I sat down on the cold floor and I wept. Meat. Real meat, sealed in stasis wrapping that gleamed under our lamp packs like something holy. Cuts of Grok's loin, dark and dense and marbled with fat. Whole joints of something labeled as antelope-class fauna from a world whose name I did not recognize, but whose agricultural output was apparently sufficient to supply the personal table of a planetary governor. There were racks of smoked poultry, their skins glistening with a lacquer of cured spice. There were sealed bladders of rendered fat, golden and aromatic even through the packaging. And beneath the meat, layered with care that spoke of hands accustomed to handling precious things, were the accompaniments. Jars of preserved fruit suspended in amber syrup. Wheels of hard cheese, each one branded with a maker's mark. Bundles of dried herbs bound with twine, their scent leaking through the wrapping like ghosts of flavors I had spent 3 years trying to remember. Sacks of grain so white and fine it looked like powder. And wine. Throne of terror. The wine. Bottles of it. Dozens of bottles, each one sealed with wax and bearing labels, written in script so elaborate that they might as well have been illuminated manuscripts. I knelt there on the floor of that vault with a bottle of wine in one hand and a packet of dried rosemary in the other, and I wept like a child, not from joy, though joy was part of it, not from relief, though relief was there too. I wept because I had forgotten. I had truly, completely forgotten that such things existed, that the universe contained anything beyond corpse-starch and recycled water and the taste of gray, and the sudden reminder of what I had lost was so overwhelming that my body simply could not contain it and expelled the excess through my eyes. Vulk stood behind me and said nothing, which was his way. Dareth, bless his terrified young heart, asked if I was all right, and I laughed through the tears and told him that I was better than all right, that we had just found the only good thing on this entire planet, that the Emperor himself, in his infinite and inscrutable mercy, had led us to this place for a reason. I did not mean it theologically. I am not, and have never been, a man of deep faith, despite what the ecclesiarchy would prefer. But in that moment, kneeling in a sealed vault beneath a ruined warehouse, on a world that had been trying to kill me for 3 years, holding evidence that pleasure still existed somewhere in the galaxy, I was as close to religious experience as I have ever come. We counted the crates, 214. Not all contained food. Some held tableware, ceramics, and crystal so fine that Dareth was afraid to touch them. Some held linens embroidered with the governor's personal heraldry. Some held decorative centerpieces, sculpted renditions of imperial saints rendered in precious metals. But the majority, at least 160 crates, held food and drink of a quality that I had never seen, not even on Sutharak Minoris. This was luxury, the kind that exists only for governors and cardinals and sector lords who dine in gilded halls, while the rest of humanity chews processed gruel. The implications seemed clear enough. These provisions had been sealed away before the war, stockpiled for the Governor Primus's personal use, and then abandoned when the conflict made this sector too dangerous. They had been sitting here for 3 years, preserved by the stasis wrapping and the hermetic seal, waiting. I reported the find to Sergeant Koreth, who reported it up the chain. For 6 hours, the question worked its way through the command structure. Lieutenant Vassar, the company's executive officer, pointed out that the morale benefit of allowing the troops to eat well for once would outweigh any administrative irregularity, and that the Governor Primus was almost certainly dead and therefore unlikely to lodge a complaint. Captain Rosketh agreed. The supplies were ours. I remember the moment the word reached the men. I was in my kitchen, already unpacking the first crates, handling each item with a reverence that I suspect looked absurd but which felt entirely appropriate, when Sergeant Koreth came down and told me that the captain had authorized a company feast. 1 meal, all the stops pulled. The best I could manage with whatever I found in those crates. I was to have 3 days to prepare, 3 days. The words settled into me like a depth charge, detonating somewhere below conscious thought and sending shockwaves through every part of my being. 3 days to prepare a meal. Not a serving of corpse-starch. A meal. A real meal with real ingredients for 873 men and women who had not tasted real food in years. 3 days to do something that mattered. 3 days to cook. I cannot adequately describe what that commission meant to me. You would have to understand the years of deprivation, the years of gray, the years of watching my skills atrophy like unused muscles, to grasp the magnitude of what I felt. It was as though a painter who had spent years copying the same image in charcoal had suddenly been handed oils and canvas and told to paint whatever he wished. It was liberation. It was resurrection. It was, and I use this word with full awareness of its weight, transcendence. I began planning immediately. The vault contained enough to feed the company several times over, so quantity was not a concern. Quality was. I had one chance to do this right, one opportunity to remind these men what food could be, what eating could mean, and I was not going to waste it on mere adequacy. This was going to be the finest meal that any of them had ever eaten. This was going to be the meal that proved food was more than fuel, that flavor was more than survival, that even here, even on Gorvan 4, even in the deepest pit of the Imperium's war machine, beauty could exist. I laid out the ingredients on my preparation surface and spent hours simply looking at them, touching them, smelling them. The grok's loin had a deep, iron-rich scent that made my mouth water so intensely it was almost painful. The herbs released their fragrances when I rubbed them between my fingers, and each one unlocked a cascade of memory so vivid that I had to stop and steady myself against the counter. Rosemary, thyme, a black seed I did not recognize that smelled of warmth and distant forests, a ground bark that burned on the tongue and then dissolved into sweetness. Each ingredient was a world unto itself, a universe of possibility that I had been locked away from for so long that the reintroduction was overwhelming. The first day of preparation I spent on reconnaissance. I tasted everything, systematically, working through the crates with a methodical intensity that left Vulk and Dareth exchanging glances I chose not to interpret. Every cut of meat, every cheese, every preserved fruit, every spice and seasoning and condiment. I spat each sample into a bowl and moved to the next, and by the end of the first day I had a complete sensory map of every ingredient at my disposal, and the beginnings of a menu forming in my mind. The menu. Throne. The menu. I must have drafted it 20 times on the first night alone, scratching notes onto the back of requisition forms by lamplight, while Vulk slept in the corner and the sounds of distant shelling provided a bass note to my fevered composition. I planned courses. Courses. The concept was so alien to the context of a field kitchen in a war zone that it felt almost seditious, as though I were staging a small culinary rebellion against the entire philosophy of military provisioning. A first course of sliced grok's carpaccio, paper-thin and dressed with herb oil, and a squeeze of preserved citrus. A soup course because I had found dried pulses and aromatics that would make a base of remarkable depth. A main course centered on the grok's loin, slow-roasted with the bone in, basted with wine and rendered fat, and that mysterious black seed that I had already begun to think of as the heart of the meal. Sides of roasted root vegetables and grain baked into rounds with melted cheese. And to finish, a preserved fruit compote soaked in wine and served with sweetened cream that I intended to whip from a tin of condensed dairy substitute that had been included, apparently, as a concession to the Governor Primos's preference for dessert. It was, even on paper, the most ambitious thing I had ever attempted. Not because of the technical complexity, which was well within my abilities given proper ingredients, but because of the scale and the stakes. 873 servings. One chance. No margin for error. And somewhere beneath the professional challenge, beneath the excitement and the planning and the meticulous attention to detail, there was something else. A hunger that went beyond the culinary. A need that I did not yet have a name for, but which pulsed in the back of my skull like a second heartbeat. Quiet and persistent and warm. I should have recognized it then. I should have known that the warmth was not my own, that the pulse was not mine, that something had taken root in the fertile soil of my deprivation and was already beginning to grow. But I did not. I was too happy, too consumed by the work, too blind with the sheer intoxicating joy of cooking again, of handling real ingredients, of feeling my skills reawaken like circulation returning to a frozen limb, painful and glorious and alive. The second day I cooked test batches, small portions, experimental, the scientist in the kitchen testing hypotheses before committing to the full execution. I seared a piece of the grok's loin in rendered fat and tasted it, and the flavor was so intense, so layered, so achingly present after 3 years of nothing, that my knees buckled and I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. It was good. Throne and Emperor and all the saints. It was good. The meat was rich and yielding, the fat crisp and fragrant, the seasoning a perfect counterpoint to the natural depth of the protein. It was the best thing I had tasted since Suthorak Minoris, and possibly the best thing I had ever tasted. And for a moment I stood there with the grease cooling on my lips, and I thought, this is enough. This is perfection. I do not need to do anything more. But the moment passed, and what replaced it was doubt. Not the productive doubt of the craftsman who refines through iteration, but something sharper, something that whispered in a voice that was not quite my own, not quite external, somewhere in the liminal space between thought and perception. The meat was good, the voice murmured, but it could be better. The seasoning was correct, but correct was not enough. Correct was adequate. Correct was the standard of a man who had spent 3 years cooking corpse-starch and had forgotten what excellence truly demanded. I dismissed the thought. I attributed it to professional ambition, to the natural perfectionism of a craftsman confronted with his first real challenge in years. Of course, I wanted it to be better. Of course, adequate was not enough. I was not cooking corpse-starch anymore. I was cooking with real ingredients for the first time in 3 years, and I owed it to those ingredients, to those men, to myself, to produce something extraordinary. The whisper was not a warning, it was motivation. It was the voice of my own suppressed talent, finally given leave to speak. That is what I told myself. The second night I did not sleep. Not from fear or noise, but from ideas. They came in a torrent, culinary inspiration so rapid and vivid I could not process it quickly enough. Combinations I had never considered, techniques I had never attempted. Flavor profiles so seductive that thinking about them made my pulse quicken and my mouth fill with phantom tastes. And underneath them all was that pulse, that warmth, that second heartbeat in my skull, louder now in the dark, closer, almost like a voice. Not a voice, not yet. A presence, something that leaned in closer every time I reached for a more ambitious idea and withdrew when I settled for something safe. I felt it the way you feel warmth from a fire you cannot see. A wiser man would have gone to the regiment's confessor, but confession requires the recognition of sin, and I did not feel sinful. I felt inspired. The presence was simply the feeling of genuine creative purpose, and if it felt larger than me, that was what purpose felt like after 3 years of gray. On the morning of the third day, the last day of preparation, I began my final work with a clarity of mind that bordered on the supernatural. Every step of the cooking process was mapped in my head with a precision that I had never before achieved. I knew exactly how long each element needed. I knew the temperatures, the timings, the sequence of operations that would bring every component to its peak at the same moment. I moved through the kitchen with a fluidity that felt choreographed, my hands finding the right tool at the right instant, my body turning from station to station without wasted motion, and the whole vast, complex operation unfolded like a piece of music that I was simultaneously composing and performing. Vulk watched me with an expression that I could not quite read. He had been my assistant long enough to know my rhythms, my habits, my capabilities, and I think he sensed that something had changed. Not something wrong, necessarily, just something different. A gear that had shifted, a threshold that had been crossed. He worked beside me in his usual careful silence, one-handed and competent, but I caught him looking at me several times with those quiet, watchful eyes, and each time I met his gaze, he looked away a fraction too quickly. He disappeared for an hour that morning. Vulk did not disappear. Vulk was the most reliable presence in my kitchen, as constant as the burner flame, and his absence registered immediately even through the fog of creative momentum that had settled over me. When he returned, he said nothing and resumed his station and began dicing root vegetables with his one good hand as though he had never left. I did not ask where he had been. The presence did not want me to ask. I learned later, much later, from a fragment of conversation that I overheard between two privates on sentry rotation, what Vulk had done with that hour. He had gone to Sergeant Korath. He had stood in Korath's makeshift quarters in the upper level of Warehouse 19, and he had told the sergeant, in his quiet, careful, deliberate way, that something was wrong with the cook, that Halvorn was behaving strangely, that Halvorn had not slept, that Halvorn's eyes had a quality to them that Volsk did not like, a brightness that looked less like enthusiasm and more like fever, and that perhaps the feast should be postponed, or at least that someone should check on the preparations, someone with authority, someone who could make an assessment that was not colored by the excitement that had gripped the rest of the company. Korath had listened. Korath was a good sergeant, a thorough man, a man who took reports seriously, even when they came from one-handed kitchen assistants with no combat authority. And then Korath had walked to the stairwell that led down to my kitchen, and the smell had reached him. The smell of the grok's loin marinating in wine and herbs, the smell of the soup base simmering, the smell of real food, proper food, the first proper food that Korath had encountered in 3 years on this world. And Korath had stood in that stairwell and breathed in, and his shoulders had dropped, and he had turned back to Volsk and said, "Leave it, Private. The man is cooking. First time in 3 years anyone in this company has something to look forward to. Let him work." The system protected me, not the presence, not the Dark Prince, the system. The Imperial Guard's own desperate need for morale, its own hunger for any scrap of normalcy in the grinding horror of Gorvin IV, shielded me from the one man who had tried to raise the alarm. Volsk had done everything right. He had identified a threat. He had reported through proper channels, and the proper channels had smelled my cooking and decided that whatever was wrong with the cook could wait until after dinner. Dareth, by contrast, was oblivious. He peeled and chopped and stirred with the enthusiasm of a young man who had been told that today, for the first time in his brief and bewildered military career, he was going to eat something that was not corpse-starch, and the prospect had rendered him almost giddy. He chattered while he worked, a constant stream of half-formed questions and exclamations. What was that spice? How did you learn to cut like that? Was the meat supposed to be that color? Is that wine for the sauce or for drinking? I answered him with a patience that surprised me, because normally I found chatter in the kitchen intolerable. But today I felt magnanimous. Today I felt large. Today the irritations of the world were small things, pebbles beneath my feet, and I was walking towards something that mattered so much more than any of them. The grok's loin went into the oven at midday. I had scored the fat cap in a crosshatch pattern and rubbed it with a paste of the black seed and dried herbs and a measure of the wine, and as it began to cook, the smell that filled the kitchen was so overwhelming that Dareth stopped talking for the first time in 3 hours and simply stood there, inhaling, with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated bliss that it made something ache in my chest. The smell rose through the ventilation shafts and spread through the building, and within an hour, soldiers were finding excuses to pass by the kitchen entrance, pausing to breathe in, their faces softening, their shoulders dropping, the war receding from their eyes for just a moment as the aroma of roasting meat reached some deep, primal part of them that 3 years of combat had not managed to kill. At 1300 hours, a mortar barrage struck the east wing of Warehouse 19. The detonation was close enough that the shockwave rattled every surface in my kitchen, sent a cascade of dust from the ceiling, and knocked a row of the governor's wine bottles from the shelf where I had placed them. 2 shattered on the floor. I heard screaming from the levels above, the sharp, specific screaming that means someone is hurt, not frightened, and the rapid thud of boots as the combat squad scrambled to defensive positions. There was shouting on the Vox, orders being relayed, return fire, casualty report. 2 dead, 3 wounded, stretcher teams to the east corridor. 100 meters from my kitchen, 2 men had just died, and 3 more were being carried past my door with their blood, leaving a trail on the flagstones. And I did not look up from my sauce. I noted the shattered wine bottles with mild irritation, because that was 2 fewer servings of a vintage that I could not replace, and I adjusted my pouring calculations accordingly, and I continued to stir. Dareth stood frozen by the wall, his face white, his hands shaking, his body caught between the instinct to run toward the danger and the instinct to stay where he was told. Vulk, without a word, picked up a cloth and began mopping the spilled wine from the floor. And I stirred. The mortar barrage lasted 11 minutes. I know this because I was timing the reduction of my sauce, and the sauce required 14 minutes at a gentle simmer, and by the time the barrage ended, the sauce still had 3 minutes remaining, and it did not occur to me until much later, much too late, that I had used an artillery bombardment as a kitchen timer. And that was when the first crack appeared. The first real crack, the one that, looking back, I can point to and say, there, that is where it started to go wrong. The smell was magnificent. The meat was cooking beautifully. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. But as I stood over the oven and breathed in the fragrance of my own creation, I felt a sudden, violent dissatisfaction. Not with the execution, which was flawless, not with the ingredients, which were superb, but with the experience itself. The smell was magnificent, yes, but magnificent was not enough. The flavor would be extraordinary, yes. But extraordinary was a word, a category, a box with defined edges, and what I wanted, what the thing in the back of my mind was whispering that I should want, was something without edges, something that transcended categories entirely, something that could not be described because no language had been built to contain it. I wanted to cook a meal that would make 873 souls forget the war. Not distract them from it, not provide a temporary reprieve from it. Forget, completely, totally, absolutely forget. I wanted to create a sensory experience so overwhelming, so total, so all-consuming that the men who tasted it would be unable to think about anything else, unable to feel anything else, unable to be anything other than vessels for the pleasure of what I had made. I wanted to obliterate their suffering with sensation. I wanted to replace the 3 years of gray with a single moment of color so vivid that it would burn itself into their neural pathways and override everything that had come before. This is not how a cook thinks. I know that now. This is something else entirely, something that wears the mask of artistic aspiration but is, underneath, a hunger that has nothing to do with food. A hunger that will never be satisfied because satisfaction would mean the end of wanting, and wanting is what it eats. But I did not know that then. I knew only that the meal was not enough and that I needed more. The combat stims were Dareth's idea, though he did not know what he was suggesting. He mentioned, while peeling root vegetables, that the stim packs the soldiers carried had a bitter chemical taste that lingered on the tongue for hours after use. He mentioned it as a complaint, a throwaway observation, but I heard it with the ears of a man who was listening for possibilities, and the idea detonated in my mind like a flare in darkness. Bitterness, lingering sensation, chemical intensity. What if I could harness that? What if a trace, just a trace of that bitter compound could serve as a counterpoint to the richness of the meat, a sharp edge that would prevent the palate from numbing, that would keep the taste buds alert and receptive and hungry for more? I told myself it was a technique. I told myself that chefs throughout the Imperium's history had used unconventional ingredients to achieve desired effects, that the line between cuisine and chemistry had always been blurred, that the difference between a spice and a drug was a matter of dosage and intent. I told myself all of this with the calm, rational voice of a professional making a considered decision, and I went to the company's medical supply station and requisitioned 4 vials of combat stimulant under the pretense of a kitchen accident that required first aid supplies. The clerk did not question me. Why would he? I was the cook. Cooks did not requisition stims for nefarious purposes. Cooks requisitioned bandages for burns, and if they happened to walk away with a few extra items, well, supply clerks on Gorven 4 had bigger concerns. I added the first vial to the sauce. Just a few drops diluted in the wine reduction, distributed so thoroughly that no individual serving would contain enough to produce a pharmacological effect. I was not trying to drug anyone. I was seasoning. I was adding a new dimension to the flavor profile, a bitter undercurrent that would make the sweetness sweeter by contrast, a chemical sharpness that would cut through the fat and keep the senses engaged. I tasted the result, and it was extraordinary. There was a depth to the sauce that had not been there before, a complexity that seemed to extend beyond the 4 walls of flavor into some 5th dimension that I could not name but could definitely taste. The heat behind my eyes pulsed with approval, and I added 2 more drops. Vulk tasted the sauce at my invitation. He held it in his mouth for a long time, his brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing. He said it was good. He said it was very good. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of confusion or concern, that suggested he was tasting something he could not identify, something that did not belong in any sauce he had ever encountered. He did not ask what was in it. Vulk was not the kind of man who asked questions that might produce uncomfortable answers. But he looked at me with those quiet eyes, and I looked away, and that was the moment, I think, when something shifted between us. A door closing, a line drawn. I used the remaining 2 vials in the marinade for the secondary cuts. And then, because the whispering in my skull was louder now, more insistent, more specific in its suggestions, I began to consider other additions. The Mediki stores contained a range of compounds that were, in strict terms, intended for therapeutic use. Analgesics, coagulants, stimulants of various classifications, each one a concentrated chemical signature, a flavor that existed outside the normal taxonomy of food, and therefore a potential tool for a chef who was no longer content to work within the boundaries of convention. I requisitioned more supplies. The clerk gave me a look this time, but said nothing. The 3rd vial I opened was not a stim. It was a neural inhibitor, a compound used to suppress pain in soldiers with severe trauma. It had a sweet, almost floral taste that was entirely at odds with its medical purpose, and when I added it to the dessert reduction, the preserved fruit compote bloomed with a warmth that seemed to radiate from the tongue directly into the brain, bypassing the normal pathways of gustation entirely and delivering pleasure as a pure, unmediated signal. I tasted it, and I laughed. Not a happy laugh, something sharper, something that came from a place I did not recognize, a laugh that sounded, even to my own ears, slightly wrong. But the food. Throne, the food. The food was beyond anything I had ever produced. The grok's loin, when I pulled it from the oven in the late afternoon, was a masterwork. The crust was black and fragrant with the seed paste, crackling under the knife, and the interior was pink and yielding, the juices running clear with a faint chemical shimmer that I attributed to the marinade, but which, I now understand, was the first visible sign of what I had done. The soup was velvet and deep, its base enriched with marrow extracted from the governor's stalks and fortified with a measure of the stim that gave it an almost narcotic warmth. The carpaccio was dressed and waiting, each slice thin enough to read through, glistening with the herb oil that I had infused with the last of the mystery spice, and a compound whose name I had not asked the clerk to identify. And the wine. I had opened several bottles to breathe, and the smell of them, mixed with the smell of the roasting meat and the herbs and the undefinable chemical complexity of my additives, filled the kitchen with an atmosphere so thick, so sensory, so overwhelming that standing in it felt like being submerged in warm liquid. Dareth had gone very quiet. Vulk had not spoken in hours. And I stood in the center of my kingdom, surrounded by the greatest meal I would ever produce, and I knew with a certainty that came from that warm, pulsing place behind my skull, that it was not yet enough. It was not yet enough, because there was one flavor I had not yet explored, one ingredient that I had been circling for hours, approaching and retreating, the way a man circles a precipice, drawn to the edge but held back by some diminishing instinct of self-preservation. The thought had first occurred to me in the early afternoon, and I had dismissed it immediately, violently, with a revulsion that I clung to as evidence of my fundamental decency. But the thought returned. It returned an hour later, softer, more reasonable. It returned again, wearing the language of culinary philosophy. And by the late afternoon, it had stopped feeling like a thought at all and started feeling like an inevitability. There were casualties in the medici station. There were always casualties in the medici station. 3 men had been brought in that morning from a patrol engagement in Sector 14, 2 of them dead on arrival, and the third not far behind. They would be processed for recycling by the regiment's logistics detail, their biological material reclaimed for corpse-starch production in accordance with Departamento Munitorum Standard Protocol Sigma 7. This was the reality of Imperial Guard logistics. This was where corpse-starch came from, in part, and everyone knew it. And everyone agreed to not think about it. And the not thinking was itself a kind of survival mechanism. But I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it very carefully, very specifically, with a part of my mind that was not entirely my own, and which spoke in a voice that was not quite silent and not quite audible, a voice that lived in the frequency between thought and hearing, like a whisper through a wall. The voice did not tell me what to do. It did not need to. It simply asked questions, and the questions led me to conclusions that felt, in the moment, like discoveries rather than decisions. What is food, after all, if not the consumption of life? What is cooking, if not the transformation of death into sustenance? And if the purpose of this meal was to transcend, to reach beyond the ordinary, to create an experience that would burn through the gray fog of 3 years' deprivation and touch something raw and fundamental in the men who consumed it, then was it not logical, was it not even necessary to include the one ingredient that contained the most fundamental truth of their existence? They had been eating their dead for 3 years in the form of corpse-starch. They simply did not know it. What I was proposing, the voice whispered, was not transgression, it was honesty. I went to the medici station as the light was failing. The attendant, a harried corporal named Fless, was busy with a new intake of walking wounded and barely registered my presence. The dead had been moved to the processing bay at the back of the facility, a cold room where bodies were stored before collection by the logistics detail. They lay on metal racks beneath sheets that had once been white and were now the color of dirty chalk. I stood in the doorway and looked at them, and I felt nothing. Not revulsion, not guilt, not the churning moral horror that should have accompanied what I was about to do. I felt only the calm, focused clarity of a chef selecting ingredients, and that absence of feeling was, I understand now, the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant that whatever was growing inside me had already consumed the part of me that would have stopped this. I selected what I needed with professional detachment. A measure of blood drawn from one of the deceased with a medici syringe into a sterile container. It was still warm. The body had not been dead long, and the blood came easily, dark and rich, and smelling of copper and something else. something underneath the copper that I could not identify, but which made the presence flare so intensely that for a moment I could not see. I sealed the container and I left, and Corporal Fless never noticed, and the dead man's name was Private Jennick Cool, though I did not learn that until later, and by then it did not matter, because by then nothing mattered except the meal. I made it halfway back to the kitchen before I stopped. I stopped in a corridor that smelled of damp rockcrete and old fire, and I stood there with the container of Jennick Cool's blood in my hands, and for one brief, agonizing moment, the smothering presence receded. It pulled back just far enough for the thing underneath, the thing that was still Brech Halvorn, the cook from Sutherak Minoris, who had been proud of making corpse-starch edible, to surface and see what his hands were holding. And the horror that flooded through me in that moment was so absolute, so pure, so physically devastating that I doubled over and vomited against the corridor wall. My hands shook, my vision blurred. I was holding the blood of a dead man, and I had taken it from his body with the calm efficiency of a man selecting cuts from a hanging carcass, and the realization of what I had become hit me with the force of a demolition charge detonating inside my chest. I poured it out. I unscrewed the container and I poured Jennick Cool's blood onto the corridor floor, and I watched it pool in the cracks between the flagstones, dark and spreading, and I told myself that this was the end. This was as far as I went. The stims were a mistake. The medici compounds were a lapse. But this was a line that I would not cross, could not cross, and the fact that I had nearly crossed it was all the evidence I needed that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with me, and that I needed to stop cooking this feast and go to the regimental confessor and beg for whatever absolution or discipline the ecclesiarchy saw fit to dispense. I went to my bedroll. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I did not pray because I had never been a man of prayer, but I focused on the face of my father and the smell of his brewing shed and the weight of the flour sack on my shoulders during harvest, and I held those memories like a shield against the warmth that was still there, still pulsing, diminished but patient, so terribly patient. I do not know how long I slept. What I know is this. I woke standing at my preparation surface in the kitchen. My hands were wet. There was a fresh container on the counter in front of me, sealed, full, and my fingers were stained to the second knuckle with a color that was too dark to be sauce. My boots were damp, and when I looked down, there were footprints tracking from the kitchen door to where I stood, a trail of prints that led back toward the Medigi wing, and I had no memory of walking it. None. The last thing I remembered was my father's face and the smell of grain. Between that memory and this moment, there was nothing, a gap, a blackness that was not sleep and not unconsciousness, but something else, something that suggested my body had continued to operate in the absence of my consent, directed by a will that was not my own, toward a purpose that it would not permit me to refuse. The warmth pulsed once, softly, as though welcoming me back. I should have screamed. I should have dropped the container and run. Instead, I opened it, and the smell of fresh blood rose to meet me, and my hands were steady, and my pulse was calm, and the horror of the corridor was already fading, already being reclassified by whatever mechanism now governed my emotional responses as a temporary aberration, a moment of weakness, a hiccup in the creative process that had been resolved by the more competent part of my psyche, while the weaker part was busy sleeping. I added the blood to the sauce. I added it slowly, in a thin stream, stirring constantly with the careful, measured technique of a man who has been trained to incorporate liquids without breaking an emulsion. The sauce changed color slightly, darkening from rich brown to something deeper, something that caught the lamplight with a sheen that was not quite natural, and the smell changed too, deepening, acquiring a metallic bass note that was savage and intimate and, throne help me, beautiful. I tasted it. I tasted it with the tip of my tongue, and what I tasted was not blood. Or rather, it was blood, but it was also more than blood. It was history. It was the accumulated experience of a human life compressed into a single drop of liquid. Every meal that Jenik Kul had ever eaten, every drink he had ever drunk, every taste and every texture and every flavor he had ever known, distilled into a crimson concentrate that contained, in some alchemical sense that I could not explain but could absolutely perceive, the essence of what it meant to be alive. The warmth in my skull became heat, the pulse became a rhythm, and the voice that was not quite a voice, spoke clearly for the first time. More, it said, and I obeyed. I returned to the Medici station twice more that night. The second time I took more blood, not from the same body, from a different one, because the voice, which was becoming less a voice and more a presence, an intelligence that seemed to occupy the spaces between my thoughts, like water filling cracks in stone, suggested that variety was important. Different lives produced different essences. Different deaths carried different resonances. A man who had died quickly, cleanly, from a single round through the brain, would taste different from a man who had died slowly, painfully, from fragmentation wounds to the abdomen, because suffering changed the chemistry of the blood, and the chemistry of the blood changed the flavor, and the flavor was everything. I am telling you this without flinching because I am beyond flinching now. The capacity for horror, like the capacity for joy, has limits, and I have exceeded both. What I did in those dark hours in the Medici processing bay was monstrous, and I knew it was monstrous, and I did it anyway, because the part of me that would have resisted had been quietly, efficiently replaced by something else. Not erased. That would have been too obvious, too sudden. The something else simply grew over it, like ivy over a wall, using the existing structure as support, while slowly, patiently, inevitably smothering it. The third time I visited the Medici station, I did not take blood. There was a body on the lowest rack that had been dead for less than an hour. The wounds were still fresh, the tissue still viable. I stood over it for a long time, and the presence in my mind was very still, very quiet, very patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to arrive at the correct answer without being told. And I understood, not because the voice told me, not because any external force compelled me. I understood because the logic, the terrible, crystalline, irrefutable logic of what I had been building toward, demanded it. The blood was a beginning. The blood was the broth. But a meal requires substance. A meal requires texture and form and the resistance of something solid between the teeth. And if I wanted this feast to be what the singing in the marrow of my spine promised it could be, the most transcendent, the most transformative, the most utterly complete culinary experience that any human being had ever undergone, then I needed to go further. I took what I needed, but not with my own hands, not this time. This time, the presence counseled delegation, and the logic was sound in the way that all of its logic was sound, flawless on the surface and rotten at the foundation. If I went to the processing bay too often, Corporal Fless would notice, and noticing would lead to questions, and questions would lead to interference. Better to send someone else. Someone who would not be questioned. Someone who would do as they were told without understanding what they were being told to do. I found Dareth in the corridor, resting against the wall with his eyes half closed, exhausted from 2 days of preparation that had pushed his young body to its limits. I told him I needed a specific cut of protein from the Medici cold storage. I described what I wanted in clinical terms, the weight, the density, the location on the rack. I told him it was a supplementary ration that the Medici were holding for the kitchen, cleared through Corporal Fless, and that he should wrap it in the stasis cloth I pressed into his hands and bring it back without delay. I spoke calmly. I spoke with the easy authority of a man giving routine instructions to a subordinate, and Dareth, young Dareth, earnest Dareth, terrified Dareth, who had attached himself to me because I was the one person in the 308th who had never shouted at him, or threatened him, or made him feel like the liability that the combat squads considered him to be, stood up without hesitation and said, "Yes, Chef." He was gone for 20 minutes. He came back with the package wrapped in stasis cloth, held carefully in both hands, and he placed it on the preparation surface, and he looked at me with an expression that I will carry with me into whatever afterlife awaits men like me. It was not suspicion. It was not horror. It was trust. Complete, unquestioning, devastating trust. The trust of a young man for the only authority figure who had shown him kindness, deployed in the service of something that would have broken him if he understood it. He did not ask what was in the cloth. He did not look at it closely. He simply delivered what I had asked for and returned to his station and resumed his work. And I took the package and I prepared it with the same meticulous attention that I applied to every other ingredient. And when it was done, I incorporated it into the main course so seamlessly that no one, not Vulk, not Dareth himself, not the 873 men and women who would eat it, would ever be able to identify it as anything other than another cut of the governor's grox. It was the small hours of the morning by the time I finished. The feast was in 12 hours. The kitchen was clean, the preparations were complete, and I stood alone in the center of my domain, surrounded by the fruits of my labor. And I felt a satisfaction so profound, so total, so all-encompassing that it seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of my body and radiate outward into the walls and the floor and the air itself, as though the building were absorbing my contentment and reflecting it back amplified. The warmth in my skull was a furnace now, constant and consuming, and I no longer tried to distinguish it from my own thoughts, because the distinction had ceased to exist. I was the warmth. The warmth was me. We were a single entity with a single purpose, and the purpose was the feast, and the feast was going to be perfect. I allowed myself 1 hour of sleep. I do not remember lying down. I do not remember closing my eyes. I only remember the dreams, which were not like any dreams I had experienced before. They had texture, they had taste. I dreamed of flavors that do not exist in nature, colors that the human eye cannot perceive, sensations that operated on frequencies so far beyond the normal range of experience that they registered not as pleasure or pain, but as something entirely other. A new category of feeling that had no name, and no context, and no precedent. In the dreams, I was not cooking. I was being cooked. I was being broken down and reduced and concentrated, my essence extracted and clarified until all that remained was the purest, most fundamental expression of what I was. And that essence was poured into a vessel made of screaming and served at a table that stretched across the void. And the guests who drank it had too many mouths and too many eyes, and their gratitude was indistinguishable from hunger. I woke, gasping. The hour was up. The kitchen was waiting. The morning of the feast was the busiest of my life, and also the calmest. There is a state of mind that soldiers describe, a clarity that descends in the moments before an engagement when the fear and the doubt and the noise all fall away, and there is nothing left but the task and the training, and every movement becomes automatic, and every decision becomes obvious. I had never experienced it in combat because I had never been a soldier, but I experienced it in my kitchen on the morning of the feast, and it was magnificent. I moved without hesitation. I cooked without error. Every element came together with a precision that felt not just planned, but predestined, as though the meal had always existed in some platonic realm of perfect form, and I was merely the instrument through which it manifested in the material world. Vulk arrived at dawn and worked beside me in silence. Whatever he had seen in my face the previous day, whatever suspicion or concern had flickered in those quiet eyes, he had either resolved it or buried it. because he said nothing and asked nothing, and simply did what I told him to do with the same careful competence that he always brought to the kitchen. I was grateful for his silence. I was grateful for his steady, one-handed efficiency, but I was also watching him with a new awareness, a new sensitivity to his presence, because in the light of the morning, with the warmth filling every corner of my mind, Volsk looked different to me. Not physically different, sensorially different. I could smell him. Not his sweat or his unwashed uniform or any of the mundane odors of military life. I could smell him, his blood, his chemistry, the particular signature of his individual biology. And it smelled sharp and clean and faintly sorrowful, like something precious that has been kept in a dark place for too long. I shook the thought off. I returned to the food. By midday, the kitchen was producing aromas that had brought half the company to our building. Soldiers crowded the corridors, drawn by smells that they had not encountered in years, and the mood was electric. Men who had not smiled in months were grinning. Men who had not spoken to each other in weeks were talking, animated, expectant, their voices carrying a note of something that took me a moment to identify before I realized it was hope. The coming meal had become an event, a focal point, a shared anticipation that had, for the first time since our arrival on Gorven 4, united the company in something other than the expectation of death. Sergeant Korath came to the kitchen at 1400 hours to inform me that Captain Rosketh had designated Warehouse 19's main floor as the dining area. The engineering section had cleared the rubble, set up lamp packs for illumination, and arranged salvaged crates and ammunition boxes into something approximating tables and benches. Someone had draped a tarpaulin over the worst of the damage, and someone else had mounted the governor's decorative centerpieces, those golden saints I mentioned, along the length of the main table, and the effect, Korath told me with a bemused shake of his head, was something between a military mess hall and a cathedral. I sent Dareth to supervise the setting of the tables while I began the final stages of preparation. The Grok's loin came out of the oven for the last time, resting under a tent of foil while the juices redistributed and the carryover heat brought the internal temperature to its peak. The sauce, my sauce, the dark and complex and terrible sauce that contained so much more than anyone would ever know, simmered on the lowest heat, its surface trembling with a life that was not entirely thermal. The soup stood ready in the largest vessel I possessed, deep and amber and fragrant with a sweetness that was partly honey and partly something else. The carpaccio was laid out on salvaged serving trays, the slices glistening, each one dressed with a single drop of the herb oil that I had spent the previous day infusing with every possible source of flavor, conventional and otherwise. And the wine was breathing. 14 bottles, opened and decanted into whatever vessels we could find. Canteens, mess tins, a hollowed-out shell casing that someone in the engineering section had polished to a mirror finish and presented to me with a solemnity that suggested he understood that this was an occasion worthy of ceremony. The wine smelled of dark fruit and old wood and a distant vanishing sweetness that was almost like grief. At 1600 hours, I declared the meal ready. The word passed through the building like fire through dry grass. Ready. The feast was ready. Come and eat. They came. They came in ones and twos at first, the officers leading, as protocol demanded. Captain Rosketh entered the dining hall with Lieutenant Vassar at his side, and I watched from the kitchen entrance as they took in the scene. The lamplit space, the improvised tables, the golden saints, the centerpieces, the impossible abundance of food laid out on salvaged surfaces that had been scrubbed clean and covered with the governor's linen. Rosketh stopped in the doorway and stared, and for a moment the mask of command slipped, and I saw underneath it the face of a man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. He swallowed. He nodded to me, a single precise dip of the chin that contained more acknowledgement than any words could have conveyed. And then he sat down and the others followed. They filled the hall, 873 of them, minus the sentries and the patrols who would rotate in later, crowding onto the ammunition box benches and the crate tables and the floor, because there was not nearly enough seating for everyone, and no one was willing to wait. The noise was immense, a rising tide of chatter and laughter and exclamation as each new arrival saw the food and reacted with the stunned disbelief of a man witnessing a miracle. I heard throne invoked more times in that first hour than in 3 years of sermons. I heard men call each other by first names that they had not used since basic training. I heard laughter, real laughter, not the grim exhalation that passes for humor in a war zone, but the genuine, uncomplicated sound of human beings experiencing joy. And I served them. I served the carpaccio first, carried out in waves by Dareth and 4 volunteers from the ranks. The slices of raw grox were laid before the men like offerings on an altar, and the silence that fell as the first mouthfuls were taken was so complete, so total, that for a moment I thought the shelling had stopped. It had not, of course, but within the walls of Warehouse 19, the shelling no longer existed. Nothing existed except the food. I watched a sergeant named Kellis take his first bite of the carpaccio and close his eyes, and the expression that crossed his face was not pleasure. It was something beyond pleasure. It was a man who had been living in a desert encountering water for the first time in years. And the shock of it, the overwhelming, disorienting shock of something good touching his tongue after so long, was almost too much for his nervous system to process. He opened his eyes and they were wet, and he looked at me with a gratitude so naked, so undefended, that I had to look away. The soup followed, hot and deep and sweet, ladled into mess tins and canteen cups and the governor's ceramic bowls. As the men drank it, a warmth settled over the hall that had nothing to do with temperature. I could feel it. Not with my skin, but with that other sense that had been developing in me, that awareness that extended beyond my own body and into theirs. I could feel their pleasure. I could taste their gratitude. The pulse behind my eyes was ecstasy. The presence was singing. I brought out the main course myself. I carved the grox loin at a table in the center of the hall, and the act of carving felt less like butchery and more like ceremony, each slice falling from the blade in a perfect pink crescent, the juices pooling on the board, the scent rising into the lamplight like incense. I plated each portion with the sauce, my sauce, pouring it with a steady hand, watching it settle around the meat in a dark, gleaming pool. And I thought of Jennick Cool and the other dead whose blood was in that sauce, and I felt nothing. I felt nothing because there was no room for feeling. There was only the meal. There was only the feast. There was only the 873 mouths opening and closing, and the pleasure blooming behind their eyes like flowers opening in time-lapse. They ate the main course in a silence that was different from the carpaccio. The first silence had been shock. This silence was surrender. The flavor filled them the way water fills a vessel, displacing everything else. Sergeant Kellis ate with his eyes closed, his jaw moving slowly, rhythmically. Captain Rosketh stared at his plate with bewildered reverence. Lieutenant Vassar was crying, quietly and without self-consciousness, tears running into his meal. I tasted their experience through the expanded sensorium that had blossomed in me over 3 days. I was in every mouth. I was on every tongue. The 873 separate experiences of my food converged inside me like rivers entering an ocean, and the ocean was vast, and it was warm, and it was hungry. There should have been a moment of doubt. The signs were there. The silence was too complete, too uniform. The soldiers were not eating. They were feeding, their movements mechanical and synchronized, their individuality dissolving into a collective experience that had less in common with a military mess and more in common with a communion. The lamplight flickered in rhythm with their chewing. The shadows moved independently of the light source. The golden saints at the center of the tables seemed to shine too brightly, and if you looked at them from the corner of your eye, the beatific smiles widened into something that had more teeth than sanctity. I saw none of this. Or rather, I saw all of it, and I interpreted it as beauty. The wine circulated. Men poured for each other with a gentleness alien to military life, handling the bottles with a reverence that was, without anyone consciously intending it, ritualistic. And beneath the tannins and the fruit, the faint chemical shimmer of my additives created a harmonic complexity that natural fermentation could never achieve. It was after the wine had been circulating for 30 minutes that the first signs of true alteration became visible. Trooper Hanneth, a stocky woman from the mortar section, stood up from her bench and began to dance. Not well, not gracefully, but with an abandon so total that the soldiers around her did not react with mockery but with fascination, watching her the way you watch a flame. Within minutes, others had joined her. 5, then 10, then 20 soldiers on their feet, moving to music that no one was playing. Sergeant Koreth, who had been eating with the measured discipline of a man who rations even his pleasures, put down his fork. I saw it from across the hall, and the presence saw it too, and for the first time since the feast began, I felt something from it that was not pleasure or encouragement or warmth. I felt alarm, a sharp, cold contraction in the center of the heat, like a fist closing around a coal. Because Koreth's eyes were clear. Amidst the glassy surrender of the soldiers lost in ecstasy, Koreth's eyes were clear and hard and focused, and they were fixed on me with the same expression that Vulk had tried to bring to him that morning in the stairwell, the expression that the smell of cooking had overridden and dismissed. He stood. He took one step away from the bench, and the step was steady, deliberate, the step of a sergeant who has identified a problem and is moving to address it. Vulk, I thought. Vulk told him. He remembered what Vulk told him, and the food was not strong enough, not in him, not in this man who has survived 3 years by trusting his instincts over his appetites. Koreth took a second step. He was looking at me. His mouth was set in a thin line. His right hand, I noticed, had dropped to his side, to the place where his combat knife hung on his belt, an unconscious gesture of a man shifting into threat assessment mode. Around him the soldiers swayed and hummed and wept, oblivious, lost, and Koreth moved through them like a man wading upstream, the only sober soul in a sea of delirium. He took a third step. He was close enough now that I could see the individual muscles working in his jaw, the tendons standing out in his neck, the effort it was costing him to resist what every other person in that hall had succumbed to without resistance. He opened his mouth. I could see the shape of the words forming. Halvorn, what have you? And then Dareth was there. Dareth, eager, earnest, impossible Dareth, who had been circulating with fresh servings, and who had noticed, with the thoughtless attentiveness of a young man desperate to please, that Sergeant Koreth's plate was only half finished. He appeared at Koreth's elbow with a fresh cut of the grok's loin glistening with the sauce, and he said, in a voice bright with the innocent pride of someone who has contributed to something good, "Sergeant, you have to try this piece. It is even better than the first." Chef Halvorn outdid himself. Koreth looked at the plate. The words died on his lips. The 3 steps he had taken toward me might as well have been 3 steps off a cliff, because what happened next was a fall, not a retreat. His hand rose from his knife to the fork. His eyes, those clear, hard, focused eyes that were the last unclouded pair in the entire hall, dropped to the meat. and the smell reached him, the smell that had overridden his judgment once before in the stairwell, and it reached him again, and this time there was no stairwell to retreat to, no distance to regain, only the plate and the sauce, and the warm, yielding surrender that I could see flooding through his body like anesthetic entering a vein. He sat back down. He ate, and the recognition left his eyes like light leaving a room when the lamp is extinguished, and in its place was the same glassy bliss that had consumed everyone else, and I watched the last line of defense crumble over a plate of food, and the presence sang, and I felt nothing at all. Vulk was the one who did not eat. I did not notice at first, because the feast had absorbed the entirety of my attention, and the presence was singing inside me so loudly that individual details had become difficult to distinguish from the overwhelming whole. But as the dessert was being served, the fruit compote with its warm, narcotic sweetness, the cream whipped to peaks that held their form like frozen clouds, I passed Volsk's station, and I saw his plate. It was untouched. The carpaccio, the soup, the main course, the wine, all untouched. He was sitting at the end of a bench near the wall, his one good hand wrapped around a cup of water, and he was watching. Not the food, not the dancers, not the soldiers who were by now openly weeping or laughing or embracing each other with a fervor that had crossed the line from camaraderie into something more primal. He was watching me. I stopped. The presence pulsed a warning, a sharp contraction of the warmth that felt almost like pain, and I understood instantly that Vulk was a threat, not because he knew what I had done necessarily, but because he had refused the feast, and by refusing it, he had placed himself outside the experience, and outside the experience he retained the capacity for judgment, and judgment was the one thing that the feast could not survive. I sat down next to him. The noise of the hall was growing louder, a rising cacophony of voices and laughter, and a strange, arrhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, or perhaps from the throats of the soldiers, or perhaps from the golden saints whose smiles were now, I was almost certain, visibly wider than they had been an hour ago. I understood, looking at him there, why he had not simply left. The hall was a press of bodies now, soldiers spilling from benches onto the floor, blocking the corridors and the doorways with their swaying, humming mass, and a one-handed man could not have forced his way through without being absorbed. Vulk was not sitting by choice. Vulk was cornered. Vulk did not look at me. He looked at the hall, at the soldiers who were in various stages of ecstatic dissolution, and he said in that quiet, careful voice of his, 4 words that I have not been able to stop hearing since. "What did you put in it, Bretch?" I could have lied. The lie was there, ready-made. "I put love in it, Vulk. 3 years of deprivation and 3 days of inspiration. What you are witnessing is the result of human beings encountering genuine pleasure for the first time in years. And if it looks excessive, the deprivation was excessive, and the correction is proportional. But the presence did not want me to lie. I told him everything. I told him about the stims. I told him about the medici compounds. I told him about the blood, about Genic Cool and the others, about the trips to the processing bay and the cuts I had made with the steady hands of a craftsman. I told him about the voice and the warmth and the presence that had been growing in me like a seed in fertile ground. And I told him that the feast was not just a meal but an offering, a gift, a consecration of sensation in the name of something that I did not have a word for, but that felt more real than anything I had ever known. I told him that the food was transcendence, that the flavor was truth, that what was happening in that hall was not corruption but revelation, the stripping away of the gray, dull lie of imperial existence to expose the raw, screaming, beautiful reality of what life could be if you were willing to taste it fully. Vulk listened. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole body, his one good hand still wrapped around his cup of water, his eyes never leaving the hall. And when I finished, he was silent for a long time, long enough that the noise of the feast rose and fell around us, like the breathing of some vast organism. And in the silence I felt the presence leaning in, attentive, expectant, waiting for whatever came next with an anticipation that bordered on delight. Vulk put down his cup. He picked up his fork. He looked at the untouched plate of food in front of him, the food that contained everything I had described, every illicit ingredient, every dark addition, every drop of stolen blood and borrowed flesh and chemical transgression. And he put a piece of the grok's loin into his mouth, and he chewed, slowly, deliberately, with his eyes open and fixed on mine. He swallowed, and something in his face changed. Not the glassy surrender I had seen in the others, something quieter, something sadder. A door closing behind his eyes, the light going out in a room that he knew he would never enter again. He looked at me, and he nodded, and the nod said, "I understand. I understand what you have done, and I understand what is happening, and I understand that it is too late, that it has been too late since the moment you opened that vault and felt chosen, and there is nothing to be done now except to eat. And so I will eat, because the alternative is to stand alone in the truth, while everyone I know drowns in the lie, and I am not strong enough for that. No one is strong enough for that." Vulk ate, methodically, without pleasure, without surrender, but completely. He cleaned his plate with the dutiful precision of a soldier, completing an unpleasant but necessary task. And when he was done, he put down his fork and folded his one good hand on the table, and his eyes glazed over, and the recognition left them, and he was gone. Not dead, not yet, but gone in the way that a man is gone when the thing that made him himself has been dissolved in something larger and more corrosive than any solvent. I watched him go, and I felt the presence's satisfaction like a physical warmth spreading through my chest, and I returned to my kitchen, and I began to prepare the final course. The final course was not on the menu. I had not planned it, not consciously, not in the rational, methodical way that I had planned the rest of the meal. It emerged from me the way a sculpture emerges from stone, the form already present within the material, waiting only for the chisel to reveal it. I moved through my kitchen in a trance of creative purpose, my hands selecting ingredients and combining them without consulting my mind, which had by this point become a passenger in its own body, watching through eyes that no longer belonged entirely to it, as the hands did things that no cook should know how to do, and no food should be capable of becoming. I will not describe the final course in detail. Some of it I do not remember. Some of it I remember too clearly, with a vividness that suggests the memories have been etched into my brain by something other than normal neurology. What I can tell you is that it was beautiful. It was aesthetically beautiful, a composition of colors and textures so harmonious that looking at it was like looking at a painting. It was sensorially beautiful, the flavors so complex that tasting it was less like eating and more like listening to music. And it was spiritually beautiful, in the way that a cathedral is beautiful, or a star, or a death. I brought it to the hall at the 20th hour. The soldiers were no longer at tables. They were everywhere, on the floor, against the walls, draped over each other in configurations that were intimate and strange. They moved languidly, their mouths working constantly, even though most had stopped eating long ago, chasing phantom flavors that lingered like ghosts. The humming had grown louder, a drone that resonated with the building itself, and the lamplight had become thick, refracting into colors that did not exist on the normal spectrum. The golden saints at the center of the tables were unmistakably different now, their smiles wider than any sculptor had carved them, their empty metal eyes now tracking the soldiers with a predatory intelligence. I felt no surprise. Everything was as it should be, and the design was not mine and never had been. The soldiers converged on the final course like drowning men reaching for air. They ate with their hands, tearing and pushing food into their mouths with a desperate urgency that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with need, the unbearable emptiness of human existence in the Imperium of Man finally being addressed by something that understood the shape of the void. Captain Rosketh ate on his knees. Lieutenant Vassar ate with his head thrown back, tears streaming, his mouth open to receive each morsel like a penitent receiving communion. Sergeant Koreth, who had nearly recognized the wrongness and been pulled back from the edge by a plate of food, ate with the focused intensity of a man who has decided to commit fully to a course of action and will not be deterred. Dareth ate with his eyes wide open and his face lit by a rapture so pure, so childlike, so utterly without reservation that looking at him was like looking at an icon of faith. And Volsk. Volsk ate with his eyes closed and his one good hand resting flat on the table and his jaw moving in that same slow, deliberate rhythm. And I could not tell, looking at him, whether he was experiencing pleasure or grief. Because in that moment, in that hall, the two had become the same thing. I did not eat. I had not eaten since the testing on the second day. The presence did not require me to eat. The presence required me to cook, and I had cooked, and now the cooking was done, and what remained was the offering. And the offering was not the food. The offering was them. I understood this at the 21st hour, standing in the doorway of my kitchen, watching 873 soldiers surrender the last fragments of their individuality to the experience I had created. The food was the mechanism, the pleasure was the medium, but the offering was not the food and was not the pleasure, it was the surrender. The complete, willing, ecstatic surrender of 873 human souls to a sensation so overwhelming that it dissolved the boundaries of the self and left nothing behind but raw, exposed, defenseless experience. Slaanesh. The name arrived in my mind like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral, resonant and final and utterly devoid of comfort. The Dark Prince, the Lord of Excess, the one who whispers in the space between desire and fulfillment and ensures that the gap is never, ever closed. I had known, on some level, that I had spent 3 days refusing to access what was happening to me. I had known that the warmth was not inspiration, and the voice was not ambition, and the presence was not my talent finally unleashed. I had known, and I had chosen not to know, because the alternative to knowing was cooking corpse-starch for the rest of my life, and the alternative to the alternative was this magnificent, terrible, beautiful, unforgivable thing that I had done. The feast ended at dawn. The light came through the gaps in the warehouse walls like an accusation, gray and flat and merciless, and it fell on a scene that belonged in no sane world. Not because the food ran out, though it had. Not because the soldiers stopped eating, though eventually they did. It ended because the offering was complete. The presence withdrew, not suddenly, not with the violence of a departing storm, but gradually, like a tide going out, leaving behind it a silence that was deeper and more absolute than any silence I have ever known. The soldiers lay where they had fallen, sprawled across the floor of Warehouse 19, in the postures of men who had been dropped from a great height, their faces slack, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths still faintly moving. They were alive. Their chests rose and fell. Their hearts beat. But whatever had been behind their eyes before the feast Whatever spark of individual consciousness and will and personality had made each of them a person rather than a body was diminished, dimmed, reduced to an ember where there had once been a flame. They did not recover fully. Some of them, the strongest-willed, regained enough of themselves to function within a few days, though they moved through the world with a new and permanent distraction, a tendency to pause and stare at nothing, to bring their hands to their mouths as though chasing a phantom taste, to weep without warning or apparent cause. Captain Rosketh resumed command but gave his orders with a flatness that had not been there before, as though the words were arriving from a great distance and losing their conviction in transit. He ate his corpse-starch ration each morning with a mechanical thoroughness that I recognized as a man trying to recapture something through repetition, chewing each mouthful for far longer than the texture warranted, searching, always searching, for a trace of what he had tasted at the feast. He never found it. None of them did. That was the cruelty of it. The feast had shown them what food could be, what sensation could achieve, and then it had taken it away, and the absence was worse than the deprivation had ever been, because you cannot miss what you have never known, but you can be destroyed by the memory of what you have lost. Sergeant Kellis began collecting things. Small objects, a spent shell casing with an unusual patina, a shard of colored glass, a strip of fabric he ran between his fingers endlessly, as though the sensation of silk on skin was a code that would unlock the door back to that night. His squad mates tolerated it. Then they began collecting things too. Trooper Hanneth, the first to dance, did not stop moving. In the quiet moments, her body continued to sway, and she hummed a shapeless drone that sometimes sounded like the noise from Warehouse 19. Lieutenant Vassar developed a habit of touching his face, pressing his fingertips against his lips with a tenderness that was deeply, disturbingly intimate, and the other officers pretended not to see. Others did not recover at all. They became catatonic, unreachable, their minds locked in an endless loop of sensory memory that they could neither escape nor fully re-enter. 47 soldiers were evacuated to the rear echelon within a week, classified as combat fatigue casualties, their eyes open and their mouths working and their hands reaching for plates that were not there. The Medici classified it as a psychological disorder brought on by stress and dietary shock. The commissar, a humorless man named Strake, who had been away from the company during the feast, accepted this explanation because the alternative, that an entire company had been corrupted by a single meal prepared by a cook, was too absurd and too horrifying to countenance. Vulk was somewhere in between. He functioned. He reported for duty. He performed his tasks with the same careful, one-handed competence that he had always shown. But the quietness in him had deepened into something that was closer to absence, as though the man I had known had been replaced by a very convincing replica that executed all the correct behaviors without any of the underlying substance. He did not speak to me again, not once. He continued to assist in the kitchen because that was his assignment, and he followed my instructions with the same precision as always, but he never looked at me. And between us there was a silence that was not the companionable working quiet of two men who understand each other, but the vast, cold, untraversable silence of two men who understand each other too well. I was not investigated. I was not questioned. I was not punished. The feast was filed away as an anomaly, a morale event that had unexpected psychological side effects, and the company's reduced effectiveness was attributed to the cumulative stress of 3 years of combat. Replacements arrived. Operations continued. The war ground on, and I continued to cook. That is the part no one tells, the part with no drama. The morning after the feast, I rose at the same hour. I lit my burners. I soaked the corpse-starch. The routine swallowed the feast the way Gorvin IV swallowed everything, grinding it down until it was just another thing that had happened. But I was different. The presence had not left entirely. It remained diminished but persistent, a faint warmth at the base of my skull. It was patient. It waited the way a gardener waits after planting a seed. I cooked corpse-starch, and the corpse-starch tasted different to me now. Not good. It would never taste good. But I could perceive complexities in it that I had never noticed before. Layers of flavor buried so deep beneath the blandness that only a palate expanded beyond its natural limits could detect them. The recycled protein had a mineral undertone that spoke of the bodies from which it had been rendered. Even the water tasted different, even the air. The feast had permanently recalibrated my senses, tuning them to frequencies that human biology was not designed to receive. I did not cook another feast. The temptation was constant, a low murmur of suggestion that accompanied every waking hour. But I resisted, not out of moral conviction, but because the presence itself counseled restraint. The first feast was a beginning, not a destination. The next offering would need to be greater, and the preparations required patience. I was being managed, developed the way a weapon is developed through successive iterations. Weeks passed, the war continued. But in the quiet hours, I began to notice things I had overlooked. The crates. Not the food crates, which were emptied and discarded. The other crates, the ones that had held the tableware and the linens and the golden saints. I had dismissed them as irrelevant luxuries. But my expanded senses revealed something else. The markings on them were not standard administrative notation. I had assumed they were because they bore the Governor Primus's seal in high Gothic script. But the symbols resonated with a frequency I could feel in the dark folds behind my thoughts, a harmonic that made the presence stir. They were not shipping marks, they were sigils. I spent 3 nights studying them, tracing the lines with my fingers, feeling the way they vibrated against my skin. And the story they told was not the story I had believed. The crates had not been forgotten. They had not been accidentally sealed away and abandoned when the war disrupted the Governor Primus's household. They had been placed here deliberately, in a warehouse that would inevitably be overrun during the course of the conflict, sealed behind a door that was welded shut just firmly enough to suggest security, but not so firmly as to prevent a determined individual with a plasma torch from gaining entry. The stasis wrapping, the hermetic vault, the perfect preservation of the contents. These were not the measures of a careless administration. These were the measures of an offering, carefully staged, patiently waiting for the right recipient. The Governor Primus had not been a loyal servant of the Imperium, or perhaps he had been once, before the same whispers that had found me in my field kitchen had found him in his gilded halls. The cult that the commissariat insisted had been eradicated in the first year of the conflict, the cult whose remnants continued to lurk in the rubble of Gorvin IV, like a disease that refuses to be purged, had not been an external infection. It had originated at the very top. The Governor Primus had been its patron, its architect, its high priest, and the crates in the sub-basement of Warehouse 19 had been his final act of devotion, a trap baited with luxury and seasoned with corruption, designed to ensnare whoever found it and transform them into the instrument of a sacrifice that he himself had not lived to perform. I was not chosen. I was selected. Chosen implies divine favor. Selected implies a mechanism, criteria applied to a population of candidates. I was selected because I was a cook, because I was deprived, because I was proud and starving for the opportunity to exercise my craft, because 3 years of sensory deprivation had hollowed me out and left me perfectly receptive to the first spark of excess. The Governor Primus had known, or the thing that spoke through him had known, that somewhere on Gorvin IV there would be someone like me, someone hungry, someone whose love of their craft could be turned into something darker. The sigils on the crates were invitations. The food was the bait. The spices, the wines, the preserved luxuries. They were already consecrated, already touched by the influence of the Dark Prince, already saturated with a resonance that would amplify the susceptibility of whoever consumed them. Not poisoned, not tainted in any detectable sense, simply aligned, tuned to a frequency that would open doors in the mind that are normally sealed shut, doors that lead to rooms where the whispers are louder and the warmth is stronger, and the voice speaks clearly enough to be mistaken for one's own. I had never stood a chance. From the moment Dareth found that bulkhead door, from the moment I cut through the welds and descended into the vault and knelt on the floor with a bottle of wine in one hand and dried rosemary in the other, I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The pride I felt, the creative joy, the sense of artistic liberation, all of it was genuine, and all of it was engineered. The tears I shed on that vault floor were real tears provoked by real emotion, but the emotion had been cultivated as carefully as any crop on Southerac Minoris, planted in the fertile ground of my deprivation, and watered with luxury until it bloomed into something that the Dark Prince could harvest. This knowledge should have destroyed me. It should have shattered whatever remained of my sense of self and left me a broken thing gibbering in the ruins. Instead, it clarified me. It completed me the way the final ingredient completes a recipe, and I understood at last the full scope of what I was and what I was becoming. Not a chef, not a soldier, not a servant of the Emperor or a devotee of the Dark Prince. I was a vessel, a conduit, a channel through which sensation could flow from the mundane world into the immaterial one, carrying with it the essence of mortal experience, concentrated and refined and elevated beyond all natural limits. I was a cook, yes, but the kitchen was larger than I had ever imagined, and the diners were not the men and women of the 308th Southerac Levy. The diners were beyond the veil, and they were always hungry. I am still on Gorvin the Fourth. I am still cooking. The corpse-starch still arrives, and I still prepare it with the same meticulous attention that I have always applied, and the men still eat it without complaint, and the rhythm continues. But the warmth is growing. The presence is building toward something, and what it is building toward is no longer a question that requires speculation, because I have seen it in dreams that taste of colors I cannot name, and I have understood. I am telling you this because the Vox was open and someone should know. Not for rescue. Rescue is not something I desire, because desire itself has been repurposed, redirected, bent toward a single all-consuming end that leaves no room for anything as small as self-preservation. I am telling you because the story has value, because the warning, if you can extract one from the wreckage of what I have told you, might save someone else. Somewhere on some other world, in some other field kitchen, there is another cook staring at another block of corpse-starch and dreaming of something better. And if that cook should one day find a sealed door, and beyond it a vault full of impossible luxury, I want them to know what I know now. The food is not the gift. The food is the hook. The pleasure is not the reward. The pleasure is the price. And the voice that whispers from the warm place at the back of your skull, the voice that tells you that you deserve this, that your talent demands this, that the only limit on your art is your willingness to reach for it. That voice is not yours. It was never yours. Vulk is dead. He walked into the no-man's land between our position and the enemy line 3 days after the feast, unarmed, without his flak armor, and he did not stop walking. The sentries called after him. The sergeant on duty ordered him to halt. He did not halt. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through, and when the enemy snipers found him, he did not flinch and he did not fall immediately. And for a long, terrible moment he stood in the open with the rounds passing through him and his face turned up to the gray sky of Gorvin the Fourth. And I hope that in that final moment he tasted something clean. Dareth is still alive. He serves in the kitchen alongside me, as eager and earnest as ever. And if there is something different about his eyes, a glassiness that was not there before, a tendency to stare at nothing and move his lips as though tasting something invisible, well, that is just the stress. That is just the war. That is just Gorvin the Fourth, doing what Gorvin the Fourth does to everyone eventually. The burners are lit. The starch is soaking. The morning is gray, as it always is, and the rhythm continues, and the warmth is patient. But I have been busy in the quiet hours, in the hours between the serving and the cleaning, in the hours when Dareth sleeps and the sentries change and no one asks what the cook is doing in the sub-basement of a ruined warehouse. I have been working, not cooking. Something else, something new. I have been packing crates. I found the stasis wrapping in the governor's stores, rolls of it, more than enough. I found the wax for sealing. I found the tools for welding bulkhead doors. And I have been learning the sigils, studying them with the expanded perception that the feast burned into my senses, tracing their curves and angles until my hands can reproduce them from memory. Each line a channel, each curve a conduit, each completed symbol a door that opens inward to a place where the warmth lives and the hunger waits. The crates are nearly ready. 12 of them, packed with care, sealed with the correct symbols, stocked with provisions that I have prepared over the past weeks. Not the governor's luxuries. Those are long gone. What I have packed is simpler, humbler, the kind of food that a desperate cook on a desperate world would weep to discover. Good ingredients, real ingredients, wholesome and beautiful and saturated with a resonance that no Medici scanner will detect and no commissar will question because it does not register as corruption. It registers as generosity. It registers as a gift. Each crate is destined for a different world. I have spoken with the logistics clerks, and for the price of a few servings of my better-than-average corpse-starch, they have agreed to route the crates through the Munitorum supply chain to worlds that I have selected with the same care that I once applied to selecting ingredients. Worlds under siege. Worlds where the regiments are tired and hungry and gray. Worlds where there is a field kitchen staffed by a cook who is proud of their craft and starving for the opportunity to exercise it. 12 crates, 12 sealed vaults, 12 doors waiting to be found by 12 pairs of hands that do not yet know what they are reaching for. I will not be there when they are opened. I do not need to be. The crates will do what the governor's crates did to me, because the recipe is the same. And the recipe works, and the recipe has always worked, on every world, in every kitchen, in every hungry heart that has ever looked at a block of gray nothing and dreamed of something more. The Governor Primus planted a seed. It found me, it grew, and now I am planting 12 more. Somewhere on a world I will never visit, a cook is going to find a sealed door. They are going to cut through the welds and descend into the dark, and they are going to kneel on a cold floor with something beautiful in their hands, and they are going to weep, and the weeping is going to feel like joy, and the joy is going to feel like purpose, and the purpose is going to feel like their own. It will not be their own, but by then it will not matter.